Chapter 1. The Man from Prince's Street. It was in the early spring of 1892, a morning made still and pale by a drifting mist that curled low over the Thames, shrouding the rooftops of London in a veil of white, that I returned to Baker Street after a brief sojourn to Aldershot. The streets were hushed beneath the fog, the horse-drawn hansoms moving like specters through the murk, and I confess to a sense of pleasure at returning to the familiar silhouette of 221B, its windows faintly aglow and the faint trace of tobacco curling through the half-open transom above the door. I had been away for only 5 days, visiting old comrades from my former regiment, and though the evenings had been lively and the brandy free-flowing, I felt a distinct longing for the peculiar rhythm of life that centered around one Mr. Sherlock Holmes. As I ascended the stairs and pushed open the sitting-room door, I was not disappointed. There he sat, precisely as I remembered him, and his dressing gown of maroon velvet, legs stretched languidly toward the fireplace. The coal fire crackled in its grate, and beside it stood the poker bench at a curious angle from some earlier experiment, no doubt. Holmes' eyes, a pale gray that gleamed with an almost inhuman acuity when caught by the light, were half-lidded as though in repose. Yet I knew better than to take his indolent posture at face value. "You've gained precisely 3½ pounds during your absence, Watson," he murmured without shifting his gaze from the flames, "and I should advise you to take the brandy in smaller portions if your Aldershot comrades insist on such nightly indulgences." I laughed, for I had long since ceased to be astonished by his uncanny perceptions. "You must tell me how you deduced that. Surely you've not tampered with the bathroom scales again?" Holmes finally turned his gaze toward me, a glint of amusement in his eyes. "No, nothing so crude. Your walking stick betrays you. It is more bowed than when you left, suggesting heavier pressure during your daily strolls, and your right boot shows signs of uneven wear, which would follow a slight favoring of the left knee, the same one you injured during your training days, a telltale consequence of increased weight. As for the brandy well, the scent lingers Napoleon brandy by my estimation, a vintage rarely poured outside of veteran circles." "You are a devil," I said, removing my coat. "A brilliant, insufferable devil. Only a mirror, Watson." Holmes replied modestly, "I merely observe that which others overlook." As I settled into my armchair and accepted a cup of tea mercifully, Holmes had not attempted to brew it himself. I noticed a fine envelope resting on the corner of the table. The address was penned in a sharply slanted hand, the seal bearing an unfamiliar crest. "You've had a visitor?" I inquired. "A letter, hand-delivered by special messenger," Holmes said, tapping the envelope lightly with a long finger. "From Edinburgh, of all places. A curious overture, and one that promises a measure of intrigue if my instincts are correct." "Scotland?" I asked, perking up. "Surely no ordinary case if it warrants your attention from such a distance." "Indeed not. And if I read the tone aright, it is a matter of some delicacy, one not entrusted to the local constabulary nor Scotland Yard. That alone suggests weighty implications. Likely something involving reputation, influence, or intellectual treachery. It mentions something called the Edinburgh Circle. Are you familiar with the term?" I searched my memory, but came up wanting. "No, I cannot say that I am." "It sounds more philosophical than criminal." "Precisely. And that, Watson, is where the danger lies. Crimes of the intellect often leave no trail, and yet their effects are far-reaching. I suspect we are about to wade into deeper waters than usual. Before I could press further, a sharp knock echoed from the hall. Mrs. Hudson's voice, ever calm and composed, announced, "A gentleman to see you, Mr. Holmes. Says his name is Lord Carruthers." Holmes glanced at the mantel clock. "Punctual. To the minute. Show him in, Mrs. Hudson." The man who entered was tall and lean, his bearing one of nobility tempered by strain. His Inverness cape hung heavily from narrow shoulders, damp with the morning mist, and his gloved hands clutched a silver-headed walking stick with undue force. His face, narrow and angular, was framed by swept-back gray hair and a beard trimmed to a scholarly point. But it was his eyes that drew the most attention, pale, cold, and restless, like one who has stared too long into troubled waters. "Mr. Holmes," he said, his accent Highland in cadence, "thank you for receiving me. I am Lord Archibald Carruthers of Dunsmuir Hall, and I fear I bring a matter of gravest urgency." "You have my attention, my lord," Holmes said, rising. "This is my colleague, Dr. Watson. You may speak freely in his presence." Carruthers offered a curt nod and took the seat Holmes indicated, perching upon its edge with the unease of a man unused to asking for help. After a brief silence, he began, "Mr. Holmes, I come not merely for your discretion, but for your exceptional insight. You may have heard of the Edinburgh Circle, a collective of scholars, reformers, and men of science based around the university. To the outside world, it is a fellowship of enlightenment and progress. But beneath that veneer lies a history of secrets, hidden histories, dangerous ones." Holmes leaned forward slightly. "Dangerous how, my lord?" Carruthers looked between. U.S. as if measuring our resolve. 30 years ago, in the Circle's earliest days, a decision was made, one involving a suppressed manuscript, a vanished benefactor, and a pact signed by 5 of its founding members. Whatever was agreed upon has remained buried since then. Until now. And now? Holmes prompted. Now, one of the 5, Dr. Erasmus McCrae, is dead. Officially an accident, found at the bottom of his library staircase. But I saw the scene with my own eyes, Mr. Holmes. McCrae was no frail invalid. He was cautious, perhaps overly so. The railing was intact, no spilled lamp, and yet he tumbled as if pushed. What's more, just the day before, he wrote to me in a state of agitation, saying that something from our past, some piece of that buried agreement, had been uncovered. "A manuscript?" Holmes inquired. Carruthers nodded slowly. "Or a copy of it. McCrae believed someone had found it, or, worse, intended to publish it. And now he is dead. Another member, Professor Alistair Fenn, has vanished without explanation. His rooms left in perfect order, save for an open window and an untouched supper. His cane, spectacles, and pipe were all left behind." Holmes was silent for a long moment. Was there a pattern to these men? A common role in the original pact? Carruthers hesitated. Yes, they were the witnesses. Holmes stood and crossed to the fireplace, his figure casting a long shadow across the hearthrug. He said there were 5 men in the original pact. One is dead. One has disappeared. That leaves 3, including yourself? 2, Carruthers corrected, his voice growing tight. The 4th, Mr. Nathaniel Blythe, was found drowned in the Leith docks 3 months ago. They called it suicide, but I am no longer sure. Holmes turned back to us, his eyes sharp. So 3 men bound by a forgotten secret. 1 dead, another vanished, a third drowned. And you, Lord Carruthers, are the last? Carruthers met Holmes's gaze without blinking. Precisely. And I believe that if I do not act swiftly, I will not be far behind. What of the manuscript? Holmes asked. Do you know what it contained? No, only that it was meant to remain buried. Burned. Even. But someone has found it or perhaps forged it. I do not know which is more dangerous. I have the key to Macrae's study. If you come to Edinburgh, I shall show you the room as it was left. You may judge for yourself. Holmes stood silent for a long moment, then turned to me with the faintest of smiles. Watson, he said, you once accused me of finding boredom more intolerable than danger. I believe we are about to test the truth of that theory once again. He faced Lord Carruthers. We shall leave by the night train. Arrange accommodations near Princess Street, and ensure nothing is disturbed at Dr. Macrae's home until we arrive. Carruthers exhaled, whether in relief or dread. I could not tell, and stood. Thank you, Mr. Holmes. You may well be saving more than my life. You may be preserving history from a very dangerous revision. With that, he turned and vanished into the morning mist, leaving behind the faint scent of damp wool and unease. Holmes stood in the silence that followed, his eyes distant. Then, almost to himself, he said, a pact, a death, a disappearance, and a circle. Curious geometry, Watson. Let us see who stands at its center. Chapter 2. A library sealed in silent sit was near twilight the following day when our train pulled into Waverley Station. The air in Edinburgh was colder than London's brisk and clean, with the breath of the sea about it, and the smell of coal smoke rising in narrow ribbons from the tightly packed chimneys that lined the city's slopes. The capital crouched beneath, a gray sky like an ancient philosopher, half shrouded in mist, with its crooked alleys and austere stone buildings brooding in solemn silence. Lord Carruthers had secured for us a pair of rooms at the Balmoral Hotel, not far from Princess Street, and from there we made our way by carriage to the late Dr. Erasmus Macrae's residence, a stately Georgian townhouse tucked along Harriet Row. The streets there were quiet and cobbled, the windows shuttered, and the lamplight just beginning to bloom across the city cast long, solemn shadows between the iron railings and craggy stairwells. Holmes sat across from me in the cab, silent and coiled, his eyes fixed not on the window, but on some internal map of logic I had long ceased trying to follow. Lord Carruthers, seated beside the driver, gave no indication of nervousness, but I noticed he smoked 2 full cigarettes in the short journey, and discarded them both half-smoked. At last, we arrived. The house itself was tall, narrow, and utterly lifeless. No light shone from within. Its windows were dark and shuttered. The iron gate creaked like a hinge in some old mausoleum as Carruthers led us up the stone steps. Dr. Macrae lived alone, he murmured, producing a brass key from his coat. No servants beyond a charwoman who came twice weekly. She found the body. The lock clicked, and we entered into a hall paneled in aged oak, the air thick with the scent of paper, dust, and something else, perhaps cloves or old smoke. The gaslights were feeble, and our footfalls echoed too loudly in the silence. The only sounds were the ticking of a long case clock and the faint scuff of Carruthers' shoes as he led us toward a door at the end of the passage. "That is the library," he said, his voice low. He fell there. The door opened with a reluctant groan. Inside, the room was immense and lined on all sides with books, dark bindings, and gilt lettering, pressed into mahogany shelves that rose nearly to the ceiling. A tall ladder rested in one corner. Heavy drapes hung beside the windows, filtering the last remnants of daylight. The fireplace was cold, the coals gray. To the right, a short flight of stairs led up to a raised platform with a writing desk, a globe, and a pair of armchairs. "There," Carruthers said, pointing to the base of the stairs. "That's where he was found." Holmes crouched silently, his eyes scanning the floor. He produced a small lens from his pocket and began to examine the worn carpet at the foot of the stairs. "There are 2 depressions in the nap," he said quietly. "Here and here, narrow, uniform boots, but not heavy ones. And here," he paused, "a scuff. The fibers are dragged toward the balustrade." "You think he was pushed?" I asked. Holmes did not look up. "I think he was not alone when he fell." Carruthers crossed to the fireplace and placed a hand on the mantel. His face was tight. The police dismissed it. There was no sign of struggle, no theft, no forced entry. "That assumes the motive was robbery," Holmes replied, now examining the handrail. "I suspect this was far more deliberate. Tell me, my lord, where are McCrae's personal effects?" "His papers, correspondence, diaries, locked in that desk." Carruthers pointed to the platform. "I haven't touched it." "Nor have the police." Holmes ascended the steps, careful as a cat, and examined the desk. "Ah, double lock? Old but sturdy. Watson, would you kindly pass me my case?" I handed him his leather kit, and within moments Holmes had produced a pair of slender instruments with which he made short work of the desk's lock. The drawers opened with a reluctant groan, revealing a collection of neatly arranged documents, some bound in leather, others tied with string. One compartment held a thick envelope marked Private Carruthers, which Holmes handed silently to our client. Carruthers accepted it with a grim nod and said nothing. Holmes examined the rest journals, correspondence, financial records, with practiced efficiency. At last he held up a thin, worn notebook bound in dark blue leather. "This may interest us," he said. "The spine is newer than the rest, recently repaired. And here, see, the pages toward the center have been removed, roughly torn." Carruthers' face darkened. "He wrote to me of a document. Something rediscovered, something dangerous. That could be it." Holmes turned a few pages back. McCrae made meticulous notes, dates, names, cross-references. He refers to the circle by code E.K. and repeatedly uses the phrase, the oath at Craigleith. "What does that mean?" I asked. "Craigleith is a district near the old asylum grounds," Carruthers murmured. "The circle met there in the early years, before we moved to the academic halls." Holmes nodded. "Listen to this entry. Blythe believes the parchment should be destroyed. Fenn remains undecided. I fear Archibald may soon be the only one still defending its preservation. That is dated 2 weeks before his death. I had no idea he wrote that," Carruthers said quietly. Holmes shut the notebook. "Which brings us to the question, who else knew of this document?" Carruthers hesitated. "At least one other man, a publisher named Dalton Harker. He was once a friend of the Circle, now estranged. He claimed years ago that the Circle suppressed a scandal and old trial, buried under academic privilege. He believed the document proved it. And Harker still lives? Holmes asked. He runs a journal, The Reformist, based in Leith, radical politics. Half his articles are conspiracy and speculation, but he was clever once, dangerous even. Holmes's eyes gleamed. Then he will be our next conversation. He rose and paced to the hearth, pausing briefly. Watson, take note. The room was locked, no sign of forced entry, yet the missing pages suggest someone knew exactly what to take and where to find it. A crime without witnesses, yet full of intention. Carruthers, still holding the sealed envelope, finally broke the silence. I do not know what I shall find in these pages, he said, almost to himself, but I have the dreadful sense that Erasmus left it for me, knowing he would not survive the week. Perhaps he did, Holmes replied, and perhaps his death was not the final move in this game, but merely its opening. The wind outside howled faintly through the cracks in the window panes, and for a long moment we stood in that room of silent books, watched by the portrait of a stern-looking man. Above the mantel, Holmes's face was unreadable, but I had traveled long enough with him to know when the scent of mystery had taken hold, and this mystery of old oaths, vanished manuscripts, and men hunted by ghosts of their own past had only begun to unfurl. Its threads. Chapter 3. The Reformist's Warning. We departed Harriet Row as dusk deepened into night, the city cloaked in a velvet fog that clung to every corner, softening the glow of gas lamps and muffling the echo of carriage wheels on cobblestone. Holmes remained quiet during the short ride back to our hotel, his long fingers steepled under his chin, and his gaze lost in the dark swirl of Edinburgh's streets. Only once, as we turned past the shadowy hulk of the Scott Monument, did he speak more, to himself than to me. A vanished manuscript, a broken pact, and 3 men who have either died or disappeared under curious circumstances. It is no longer a question of whether this is murder, Watson, but what precisely is being killed thee. Men, or what they once concealed. We had just returned to the Balmoral when a small boy in a page's uniform approached us at the lobby, clutching a telegram in both hands. Holmes accepted it with a nod and tore the envelope open. He scanned it swiftly, then passed it to me. Without comment, from Inspector Alistair McLennan, Edinburgh Constabulary to Sherlock Holmes, Balmoral Hotel Re. Professor Alistair Fenbody recovered from Calton Hill Woodland. Preliminary. Identification confirms as Fen. Details to follow. Foul play suspected. Holmes turned away without a word and crossed to the window. Outside, the city's spires pierced the night like solemn sentinels. 3 men connected to the Circle, he said softly. 3 deaths within months, and now only Lord Carruthers remains. And a certain publisher named Harker, I reminded him. Holmes nodded. Indeed, the thread draws tighter. He slept only briefly that night, pacing the floor until nearly 3 o'clock, occasionally scribbling in his notebook or pausing by the window to gaze into the fog. By morning he was already dressed and seated at the breakfast table when I joined him, scanning the Scotsman with dispassionate focus. "There's nothing here about Fen," he muttered. "They're holding it back, likely awaiting confirmation or fearing the social ramifications. We ought to visit the constabulary, I suggested. In due time, Holmes replied. But first we must pay a call on Mr. Dalton Harker. He is the only outsider with intimate knowledge of the Circle's darker corners, and he may well hold the missing piece. We took a cab through the winding roads of Leith, passing down through narrower streets where the city lost its grandeur and became more industrial, more lived in. Tall, weather-stained buildings loomed over cramped shop-fronts and taverns, their windows fogged and yellowed. At last the driver drew up in front of a 3-story building, marked with the faded signage of the Reformist Weekly Journal. The curtains on the upper floor were drawn. The door below stood ajar. Inside, the offices were quiet, the front chamber filled with old pamphlets, broadsheets, and the acrid tang of printer's ink. A wiry clerk, ink-stained and bespectacled, looked up from his desk with the startled expression of a man rarely visited. "Mr. Harker?" Holmes asked briskly. The clerk blinked. "Upstairs. Would I warn you, sir, he's in one of his moods." We ascended a narrow staircase to a set of rooms above the printing office. Holmes knocked once, then pushed the door open. Within, seated behind a desk strewn with papers, pamphlets, and cigarette ends, sat a man with a hawk-like nose and a neatly trimmed beard. His eyes were sharp, suspicious, and rimmed with sleepless circles. The room was warm, but close, the air thick with the aroma of stale tobacco and damp wool. "I assume you're Sherlock Holmes," the man said without rising, "and that would make you Dr. Watson. We do seem to precede our reputations," Holmes replied, removing his gloves. "May we sit?" "You may as well," Harker said. "But if you're here to defend the sanctity of the Edinburgh Circle, you can leave now." "We are here," Holmes said evenly, "because 2 of its founding members are dead. A 3rd has vanished, and the remaining survivor believes the Circle's long-buried secrets are bleeding into daylight." Harker raised an eyebrow. "And you believe me to be the cause?" "I believe you may know what it is they were hiding, and why someone is killing for it." Harker leaned back in his chair. "Is Carruthers behind this inquiry?" "He is our client," Holmes confirmed. "But he has told us very little. We seek clarity." Harker's gaze drifted to the window. "Clarity. That's rich, coming from a man like Carruthers. Did he tell you about what happened in 1862? About the trial they covered up? About the man who vanished from the university records?" "No," Holmes said, "but I suspect you are about to." Harker snorted. "The Circle once claimed to be a society of free thinkers, philosophers, scientists, reformers. But they were gatekeepers, Holmes. They kept the knowledge that suited them and buried the rest. There was a student, a brilliant young fellow, Gideon Bracknell. He wrote a paper challenging a number of ethical claims made by one of the Circle's elder members, Lord Rutledge. Accused him of falsifying data in his experiments on children at the Craigleith Asylum. Caused an uproar. Holmes's eyes sharpened. "What became of Bracknell?" "He was expelled in disgrace," Harker said. "The records were scrubbed. Rutledge died a few years later, and the scandal vanished with him. But Bracknell, he disappeared. Some say he changed his name, others that he went abroad. The Circle made sure no one found out. That was the pact." "And this manuscript?" I asked. "The one Dr. McCrae mentioned?" Harker leaned forward. "It was Bracknell's rebuttal, his evidence. He had it printed secretly. A few copies were said to exist. I tried for years to find one. Last month, someone sent me a page, just a fragment, but enough to confirm the manuscript was real. "And who sent it?" Holmes asked. "No name. Just a return address in York. The handwriting was careful disguised, I'd wager. But the page was authentic. Referenced experiments that matched asylum records I'd uncovered years ago. I meant to publish it in next month's issue. Then I heard Blythe was dead." "You told no one?" Holmes asked. "I told a colleague. She works with me on the editorial board. Her name's Isabel Kerr. Brilliant woman. We agreed to delay publication until we could verify the source. That was last week. Then the page disappeared from my office drawer." Holmes nodded slowly. "You believe someone is hunting those tied to Bracknell's suppression, and they now have a copy of his manuscript." "I believe," Harker said, "that someone is tying up loose ends. The Circle's members were once men of influence. Some still are. If the manuscript surfaces, it could ruin reputations, unseat titles, even bring charges. And that, Mr. Holmes, is worth killing for." There was a silence in the room, broken only by the distant clatter of the press below. Then Holmes stood. "Mr. Harker, I thank you. You've been most helpful. You believe me, then?" "I believe your account fits a puzzle that is only now coming into focus," Holmes said. "May I ask that you take care not to be alone these coming nights?" Harker gave a bitter smile. "I stopped walking home alone years ago." As we descended the narrow staircase, Holmes turned to me. "What do you make of it, Watson?" "The implication is clear," I said. "Whoever preserved that manuscript has it now, and they're silencing anyone who knew of it." Holmes nodded. "It seems we must next learn what became of Gideon Bracknell. If he vanished without trace, I shall be very surprised indeed." Outside, the fog had thickened, and behind us, in the gloom above the printing office, the silhouette of a man watched from a narrow upper window, still as a statue. Chapter 4. Beneath the stones of Craigleith. It was a bitter morning when we set out for the old Craigleith grounds. A cold iron wind swept in from the Firth of Forth, stirring the bare branches of the elm trees that lined the western edge of Edinburgh. The skies hung low and colorless, and even Holmes, who typically seemed impervious to inclement weather, buttoned his coat tightly and pulled his scarf up to his chin. Craigleith Asylum had long since ceased its original function. Once a state-of-the-art mental hospital during the mid-century reform period, it had fallen into disuse following a scandal in the 1870s, and had since been partially converted into a records archive for the Royal College of Physicians. Its east wing, crumbling and long condemned, stood abandoned, its windows boarded and vines clawing up the stone like skeletal fingers. There is something particularly melancholy about institutions once meant for healing becoming mausoleums. Of silence, I observed as we walked up the gravel path, our footsteps crunching beneath us. Holmes gave a sideways glance. And yet how fitting. Secrets are always most comfortably buried where minds once wandered unchecked. The main entrance was attended by a caretaker, a stooped, silver-haired fellow named Mr. Lyle, who eyed us with suspicion until Holmes produced a letter of introduction from Lord Carruthers. Once reassured, Lyle led us into a dim hallway smelling of damp paper and old wood polish. Walls that once echoed with the footsteps of physicians and patients alike were now lined with iron filing cabinets and yellowing index cards. "I was told you were seeking records from before the merger," Lyle said as he led us into a small study, its single oil lamp casting long shadows across the shelves. "Not all have survived, mind you. We had a fire in '89 and a flood last spring, but some of the old registries remain. We are searching for anything relating to a patient or student named Gideon Bracknell," Holmes said. "Circa 1862, possibly associated with experimental trials at the institution." The old man furrowed his brow. "Bracknell? That name doesn't ring familiar, but we'll see." He reached up and retrieved a bound ledger nearly the size of a tombstone, its leather cracked and spine held together by string. If he were formally admitted or corresponded with the Circle through the hospital, he'd be in here. As Lyle began to thumb through the brittle pages, Holmes turned his attention to a faded photograph hanging beside the hearth. It was a black and white portrait of the hospital's founding members, all in stiff-collared suits, seated in a semicircle in front of the asylum's main steps. "Watson," Holmes murmured, beckoning me to join him. "Look closely." I peered at the photograph. One face immediately drew my attention, a man seated at the far right, slightly younger than the others, his eyes deep-set and alert, his jaw narrow and his mouth drawn in a half-frown that seemed somehow more expressive than the rest. "Do you think that's Bracknell?" I asked. "No," Holmes replied, "but I believe that man is Lord Rutledge, the one Harker, accused of falsifying records. And note the shadow beside him. Someone was clearly meant to sit there, but the figure was removed. The blotching of the chemical process suggests deliberate tampering." I looked closer. Indeed, the photographic chemicals left a distorted smear beside Rutledge's left shoulder, as though an individual had been scrubbed from the image. "You think they removed Bracknell from the photograph?" "I think," Holmes said softly, "they removed whoever posed the greatest threat." At that moment, Mr. Lyle gave a surprised grunt. "Here, a mention of Bracknell barely mind. Not as a patient, but he appears in a physician's correspondence, Dr. Horace Glenmere. He was the chief experimentalist for a short time." Holmes took the ledger and read aloud. "Correspondence received the 12th of April, 1862. Subject GB expresses concern over publication of disputed methodologies. Glenmere notes tensions among Circle members. Recommendation: all references to Bracknell be omitted from trial proceedings moving forward." Holmes closed the book and looked up. So he wasn't merely suppressed, he was officially expunged, his very name struck from the records. "Is there anything further from Dr. Glenmere?" I asked. Lyle shook his head. "Not in this volume, but if he had personal notes or case papers, they'd be in the restricted archive in the West Wing. We don't generally open that section on safe floors, collapsed ceiling. That wing's been shut for years." Holmes straightened. "Then that is precisely where we must go." Lyle frowned. "I wouldn't recommend it." "Your concern is noted," Holmes said briskly, "but delay may cost lives. Do you have a lantern?" We followed Lyle back into the main corridor, and then down a side passage half consumed by dust and neglect. The air turned colder as we passed into the West Wing. Here the silence was oppressive, broken only by the faint groan of beings above, and the occasional echo of our own footfalls. Peeling paint hung like skin from the walls, and old medical posters lay curled on the ground like dead leaves. We reached a warped wooden door, its hinges rusted but still intact. Lyle handed Holmes a narrow oil lamp and opened the door with some difficulty. The smell of mold and decay struck us instantly. "You've 15 minutes," the caretaker said with a grimace. "No longer that part of the roof is ready to go." "Understood," Holmes said. Inside, the room was lined with heavy wooden cabinets, their drawers tagged with copper labels, worn nearly smooth with age. Holmes moved with focused intent, brushing aside cobwebs and opening drawer after drawer. At last he froze. "Here," he said. A file marked G.M. Glenmere Horace. He withdrew a bound folder and turned to the first page. For a few moments, only the sound of rustling paper broke the silence. Then he drew in a breath and read aloud. "Subject G.B. is returned with new documentation and demands rebuttal be heard by full circle counsel. Accuses me of manipulation. Claims he has letter from asylum witness, a patient attendant named Andrew McKinnon. McKinnon has since vanished." He turned the page. "Blythe advises immediate resolution. Rutledge furious. Fenn suggests compromise. Carruthers remains uncertain. I fear Bracknell will not yield." Another page followed, this one shorter, scrawled more hastily. "Decision made tonight. Sealed at Craigleith under the clock tower vault. Key retained by Rutledge. Pact signed by all 5. Holmes's eyes flashed. So it was real, the manuscript, and it was hidden here under the very institution that tried to bury him. Sealed in a vault, a clock tower. I looked up. "But the tower was torn down during the renovations, wasn't it?" "Indeed," Holmes said, tucking the folder into his coat. "But stone foundations rarely forget. The vault may still remain." As we turned to leave, Holmes paused. "One more thing. Watson, what do you make of this?" He pointed to the far corner of the room where an old examination table stood beneath a sheet of glass. Etched into the grime of the surface was a name, scratched by hand, Gideon, and beneath it, a single word, betrayed. A chill ran through me that had nothing to do with the damp. Holmes stared at the crude carving for a long moment before snuffing the lantern. "We are dealing," he said softly, "not merely with a killer, but with a man who remembers." Chapter 5. The Editor's Contradiction. The next morning dawned gray and reluctant, with a cold drizzle spitting down from a sky that refused to brighten. Edinburgh's streets shimmered with rain-slicked stone, and the wind whipped through the alleys with a keening sound that reminded me, strangely, of a mourner's wail. Holmes seemed invigorated by the weather, pacing the length of our hotel room with the restless energy of a hound catching scent. He had already reviewed Dr. Glenmere's archived files twice by the time I had finished my coffee and toast, murmuring to himself as he traced timelines and cross-referenced names in his notebook. At last he snapped it shut with a decisive click. "We are at a crux, Watson," he said. "The manuscript was sealed under the old clock tower vault buried. No doubt, to avoid scandal, but someone has either found it or fabricated its contents. Either possibility is dangerous. What remains uncertain is who benefits from resurrecting these ghosts now." "You think someone may be using the manuscript as leverage?" I asked. Holmes nodded. "Or as justification. If the manuscript has indeed surfaced, and it contains what we suspect proof of unethical experimentation, falsified academic records, institutional cover-ups, it could destroy reputations, perhaps even titles, and we believe Dalton Harker has or had a portion of it. That is precisely what we must verify. But I do not trust Harker's account entirely. Something about it strikes me as too conveniently aligned with the narrative he's been publishing for years. A righteous outsider, finally vindicated he, wears it like a robe. Then we find the seam in his story, I said. Indeed? Holmes retrieved his coat and hat. We pay a call on Miss Isabel Kerr. We made our way through the damp streets of Stockbridge, where narrow lanes ran like tributaries between tall, gray stone buildings. The address Harker had given us belonged to a quiet row of Georgian flats, fronted by neat iron railings and potted. IV. Miss Kerr's lodgings were on the upper floor, and when she opened the door, I was immediately struck by the contrast between the world outside and the one she had created within. Her parlor was warm and well appointed, with books stacked and towers around a large desk by the window. A fire crackled in the grate, and the scent of sandalwood lingered in the air. She herself was perhaps in her late 30s, with sharp eyes and an even sharper manner. She wore a high-collared black blouse and a charcoal skirt, her hair pulled back tightly, revealing a high brow and the subtle line of a scar above her left temple. "You'll want to sit," she said, motioning toward the armchairs. "You're here about Harker, I take it?" Holmes inclined his head. "And about a manuscript said to have passed briefly through his hands. He claimed you were present when it arrived." Kerr's expression tightened, though she did not seem surprised. She sat across from us, resting one ankle over the other, hands clasped neatly in her lap. "I was," she said. "A page, not the full thing. Anonymous post, no return address." Harker was beside himself. Said it vindicated everything he'd written for the last decade. "You believed it was authentic?" I asked Dot. She hesitated. "I believed it was something. Old, certainly. The language was precise, methodical. The typeface consistent with mid-century academic prints. It referenced Craig Leith and the so-called Bracknell affair, though not by that name." Holmes leaned forward. "And the page, what became of it?" Kerr's eyes narrowed slightly. "Harker said it was stolen. Claimed it vanished from his desk. But I found that odd. We have a locked box in the office. I asked if he'd stored it there. He said no. Claimed he wanted to re-photograph it. But no prints were ever made. Then, 2 days later, he told me someone had broken in." "Did he report the break-in?" Holmes asked. "He said he did. But when I asked to see the police report, he changed the subject. That was unlike him." Holmes nodded slowly, eyes glinting. "And did he mention anyone else who knew of the manuscript?" Kerr shook her head. "Only Lord Carruthers, though. I suspect he exaggerated their correspondence. Harker is fond of implying clandestine exchanges where none exist. He thrives on the aroma of conspiracy. What of his movements last week?" Holmes asked. "Around the time Dr. McCrae was killed." Kerr's face took on a guarded expression. "Why?" Holmes stood and walked to the window. Rain patterned faintly on the glass. "Because the more we examine the movements of the men involved in the circle, the less natural their demises appear. and the more deliberate. Kerr's voice was soft when she answered. "I can't give you certainty, but I know Harker disappeared for 2 days last week, said he went to York to consult a source. But he returned with nothing but a hangover and ink-stained fingers." "York?" Holmes murmured. "The same city the fragment was allegedly posted from." She nodded. "Yes, that struck me too." Holmes turned to her. "Miss Kerr, do you believe Dalton Harker could fabricate a manuscript in whole or in part?" She was silent for a moment. Then, "Yes, I believe he's capable of it. Not out of malice, out of conviction. He sees himself as a truth-bearer, even when the facts don't align. He would argue the greater good requires a little invention." Holmes's expression grew still, unreadable. "I would like a copy of any correspondence between Harker and his sources," he said, "especially anything related to Bracknell, Glenmere, or the Circle." "I can arrange that," Kerr said. "But be careful, Mr. Holmes. Whatever's unfolding here, it's not only old scandal. Something new is happening. I can feel it in the air." "Quite so," Holmes said, retrieving his hat. "And it may already be too late to stop it." We stepped back into the wet street, the rain now light but insistent, tapping at Holmes's coat as he paused beneath the awning. "Well?" I asked. "Is Harker lying?" "He is." "Shaping," Holmes said, "molding the narrative. The page may be genuine, but I suspect its disappearance was no accident. It allowed him to remain the sole authority on a document he neither fully possesses nor understands." "And the York trip?" "That," Holmes said, "troubles me most of all. It suggests a second player, someone who either sent the page or wanted it back." We turned toward the city's heart, its skyline etched in wet stone. The air held a charge now, like a wire drawn too tight. Somewhere in the maze of Edinburgh's alleys and archives, truth waited buried beneath oaths, betrayals, and silence. But Holmes, as ever, was listening for it. Chapter 6. The Ledger of the Dead. The rain did not let up for 2 days. It came in long, cold sheets from the east, lashing against rooftops and rolling down the gutters like gray torrents trying to wash the city clean. But Edinburgh had long been soaked in secrets too deep for mere weather to scour. Holmes, however, was at his most active. In our rooms at the Balmoral, he worked through the hours with the single-minded intensity of a man chipping away at marble to reveal the form beneath. He wrote letters, sketched diagrams, mapped connections between the members of the Edinburgh Circle across timelines that stretched back decades. He circled names: Bracknell, Glenmere, Rutledge, Carruthers, McCrae, Fenn, and now a new one, Harker, underlined in ink more uncertain than the rest. It was after breakfast, on the 3rd morning since our visit to Miss Kerr, that Holmes rose. Suddenly from his chair, having stared at a small annotation in Glenmere's files for nearly half an hour. "Watson," he said, "do you recall the Glenmere letter referencing the sealed vault beneath the clock tower?" "Of course." "And? Do you recall how he added that Rutledge retained the key?" "Yes." Holmes turned to the window, the city blurred beyond with fog. "I believe the key was never literal, but referential. Rutledge was a man of ritual, aristocratic, meticulous, a man who would document what others feared to speak aloud. If a true record of the Circle's more damning decisions exists, it is likely he preserved it himself, somewhere safe, somewhere only he could access. You think Rutledge left a record of the pact? I do. And if that record survived, it will be at Rutledge Hall. Rutledge Hall lay 15 miles outside Edinburgh in the countryside near Linlithgow, a brooding, ivy-strangled manor that once hosted philosophers, scholars, and men of science in its grand salons. Since the death of Lord Rutledge nearly 20 years ago, the estate had passed to a distant cousin, a Major Theodore Rutledge, who spent more time in Africa than Scotland and had let the house fall to ruin. Fortunately, a telegram from Lord Carruthers secured us permission to visit. By early afternoon, we were rattling along the country lanes in a hired carriage, passing through bare, wintry fields under a sky that looked like cold pewter. The countryside here was desolate, the hills hunched and brooding. Holmes stared out. The window, his fingers tapping a rhythmic pattern against his thigh. We arrived at Rutledge Hall just past 3 o'clock. The house loomed at the end of a narrow drive, choked with wet leaves and overgrown hedges. Its facade was classical porticoed and symmetrical, but age and neglect had turned its grandeur to melancholy. Cracked window panes, moss-streaked columns, and iron gates that moaned when opened. A caretaker greeted us with cautious curiosity. He was a gaunt man in his 60s with hollow cheeks and the distracted manner of one long accustomed to silence. "You'll want the library," he said, leading us through a vast, dark entrance hall where portraits of grim-faced Rutledges glared down at us from under thick veils of dust. His lordship kept everything there. Diaries, letters, society minutes. Had a fireproof cabinet installed. Used to lock it with a cipher? A cipher? Holmes asked. Interest quickening, the caretaker nodded. He was particular about such things. I never knew the code. Only he did. Might be somewhere in his journals. The key cabinet hasn't been opened in 20 years. The library was vast and vaulted, its tall windows sheathed in grime, and its oak shelves bowed under the weight of dusty volumes. The hearth was cold, the room smelling faintly of tobacco, parchment, and old varnish. In the far corner stood the cabinet in question, tall, brass-handled, its door inlaid with a dial marked with Roman numerals. Holmes examined the cabinet in silence, fingers grazing the dial. "It's a variation of the Amsler lock," he murmured, "popular among secretive antiquarians in the mid-century. A 10-digit rotational cipher based on personal logic." He turned to the desk and rifled through a collection of bound ledgers, journals, and monographs, all neatly labeled in Rutledge's rigid handwriting. He was systematic. Likely the key is encoded in something he valued, most perhaps a date or quotation. Holmes flipped open one of the volumes. "Ah, here." He pointed to a series of underlined entries. March 3rd, 1862. Council votes unanimously to restrict all public mention of Bracknell. Glenmere to amend records. March 13th. Carruthers raises concern over suppression. Blythe reassures. Fenn uncertain. Pact sealed under Craigleith stairwell. March 27th. Final council convenes. Let us not merely bury danger, but tether it with silence. Holmes's eyes narrowed. 3 threes. March 3rd, 13th, 27th. A pattern? 3 increments of 10 days. And the last quote? That's from Tacitus. Holmes moved to the dial and spun it in silence. 3:13:27. A click. The cabinet creaked open. Within was a black leather ledger, thick and bound with a brass clasp. Holmes opened it carefully, his face unreadable. The pages were inscribed, in Rutledge's neat, serifed hand, the title, Observations on the Inner Circle of Scientific Philosophy, Private Register. Below it the words, For my heirs or my conscience, whichever arrives first. He began to read aloud. Bracknell has become an obstacle. His accusations, though flawed in method, are sound in essence. Glenmere fears exposure. McCrae speaks of leaving the circle. I suspect Fenn is already in communication with Carruthers to dissolve our quorum. We debated the matter under the stairwell at Craigleith, the place where Glenmere conducted his final trials. A vote was held, not on guilt, but on silence. We chose secrecy. For the good of the institution, for the good of progress, we buried Bracknell's paper. But he did not forget that I have reason to believe he lives still, under another name. A man called Graham Duval has been asking questions in York. His letters match Bracknell's earlier syntax. If it is he means to unearth us, I cannot yet decide whether he deserves justice or oblivion. I felt a chill steal over me. Bracknell survived? Holmes's voice was low, and if he assumed a new identity, he may have been hiding in plain sight. York, the fragment, the anonymous sender. This Duval may be the same man who contacted Harker. But Harker said he never met the sender, which no longer seems entirely likely, Holmes replied. This ledger makes it clear Rutledge believed Bracknell or Duval had begun hunting those who wronged him. That was nearly 20 years ago. He may have bided his time or waited until the right moment to reappear. He turned to the final entry, dated 1867. I no longer know if we were wrong or merely afraid, but I have locked this record away as a confession. If they come for me, let it be known I tried, in the end, to unwrite what we wrote. Holmes closed the ledger. There is no doubt now. The manuscript is real. The Circle's pact was deliberate. Bracknell may have lived, and someone, either he or another in his stead, is executing a reckoning. He handed the ledger to me, and I placed it carefully in my satchel. Outside, the storm had begun again, rain lashing the windows of Rutledge Hall. But inside the library, I felt the tremor of something far older than weather. What next? I asked. Holmes turned to the darkened fireplace. Now we find Graham Duval. Chapter 7. Whispers in York. It was just after dawn when we boarded the express from Waverley Station, bound for York. The rain had eased, but Edinburgh remained, veiled in gray, as though reluctant to relinquish the secrets Holmes had begun to unearth. Holmes, as usual, traveled light, a valise containing only his notebooks, a collection of correspondences, and the Rutledge ledger now nestled carefully between clean linen. He was in one of his intensely focused moods, eyes closed for long stretches, of the journey as though meditating, then suddenly snapping open to scrawl a thought or cross-reference a name. I did not interrupt him. I had grown accustomed over the years to the rhythm of his deductions, the gathering storm, the inward collapse, and the final striking of lightning. Only once, as we crossed the wide Northumbrian plains, did he speak. If Bracknell did assume the identity of Graham Duval, he said, then we must ask not only where he has been, but why he would reveal himself now. To Harker, and to whom else? Revenge, perhaps, I offered. Delayed justice? Possibly. Or perhaps something more calculated. There is always a difference between a man seeking vengeance and one staging a trial. We arrived in York just after midday. The city stood quiet beneath a low white sky, its medieval streets still damp from the night's storm. Chimneys exhaled, thin threads of smoke, and the great towers of the minster loomed above the rooftops like twin sentinels carved from mist. Holmes had made arrangements to meet a local solicitor named Fergus Halberd, whose firm had previously handled property, inquiries, and document registrations across the county. The man was already waiting at the Yorkshire Club, a clean-shaven fellow in his 40s with tidy manners and an appetite for gossip disguised beneath propriety. I took the liberty of retrieving what records I could find. "Mr. Holmes," Halberd said as we took our seats in a private room, "the name Graham Duval appears in a few scattered places. An address registered at King Street, some public notices, even an anonymous editorial in the Yorkshire Register signed G.D. But there's no birth record, no school registration, and no occupation listed with the guilds." "A construct," Holmes murmured. "Precisely. Whoever he was, he wanted to be known, but not known well." The address on King Street was a rented room above a print shop, paid for in advance, 6 months at a time. "No one's used it since October last." "Is the proprietor of the shop available?" Holmes asked. "I believe so. He lives on the premises. I took the liberty of sending word that you might call." Holmes stood, pleased. "Then we waste no time. The shop at 47 King Street was a narrow, soot-darkened building with a painted sign that read Chamberlain's Lithography and Design. Inside, the scent of ink and drying paper still lingered, though the workbenches were quiet. A man of middle age, short and balding, emerged from the back room, rubbing his hands with a rag. "You'll be the London gentleman," he said. "Mr. Halbert wrote to me. Come about Mr. Duval, I take it." "We are particularly interested." "In his habits," Holmes said, "and whether he left anything behind." Chamberlain scratched his chin. Strange fellow, he was. Polite, always paid on time, but quiet, kept on hours. Came and went mostly in the evenings. Printed things pages. Of something, though I never read them. Brought his own plates. Said it was for academic use. Did he receive any correspondence? Oh, yes. Small envelopes, always postmarked from Edinburgh. Regular, twice a month, sometimes more. He'd smile when they arrived. Sometimes he'd leave for days after reading one. Holmes's brows lifted. And the room? Still locked. I kept it as he left it. Haven't had the heart to rent it again, to be honest. Would you permit us a look? The man fetched a brass key from beneath the desk and led us up a narrow staircase to the second floor. The room was small, but not unpleasant modestly, furnished with a desk, bed, and a washstand. The curtains were drawn, the hearth long cold, but everything had a preserved quality, as though waiting for a tenant who might yet return. Holmes immediately moved to the desk. It was empty on the surface, but within the drawer he found a small ledger bound in gray linen. Inside were fragments, lists of references, snippets of Latin, fragments of correspondence that had been meticulously copied by hand. Some were marked with initials: C for Carruthers, F for Fenn, R for Rutledge. Holmes turned a page and let out a soft exhale. "Watson, read this." I leaned over his shoulder. On the page was a copied note, written in a cramped, looping hand. You all agreed, and now you plead ignorance. I watched you bury the truth. The vault is no longer sealed. Let us meet one last time, or I will unbind everything. G.D. Good God, I murmured. This was sent to one of the circle? More than one, I'd wager, Holmes said. This is not a threat. It is an invitation. He wanted them to face what they did, and now they're being removed one by one. He flipped further into the ledger, stopping at a pasted envelope with half its contents torn. The remaining scrap. Read March 6th, the garden behind St. Bartholomew's. If you come alone, we may yet find peace. Holmes snapped the book shut. Watson, we must locate St. Bartholomew's. Another meeting place? Possibly. Or the site of a confrontation, perhaps one of the last. St. Bartholomew's turned out to be a modest church nestled at the edge of the shambles, its red stone darkened by time and soot. The garden. Behind it was modest, a patch of grass ringed with yew trees and crooked gravestones, with a rusted bench beneath a weeping ash. Holmes examined the ground closely, moving in silence through the half-dead grass. At length he crouched beside the bench and picked up something small. A cufflink, he said, holding it up. Gold. Inscribed with the letter F. Fen? I asked. Without doubt. And the style matches the one worn in his last portrait. Holmes rose. I believe this was the final meeting between Duval and Fen or Bracknell. If we are right, it did not end well. But Fen's body was found miles away, I said, which suggests he did not leave here willingly. Holmes turned, staring, down the narrow alley leading from the garden to the road. Someone is rewriting the record. The circle buried the truth once, and now someone is exhuming it, line by line, with blood for ink. He fell silent, gazing toward the towers of the minster rising in the distance. This city holds more than graves, Watson. It may yet hold the voice of a ghost who refuses to stay buried. Chapter 8. The trap is set. We return to Edinburgh. The following day, beneath a gun-needle sky that brooded low over the rooftops, as though pressing the city under the weight of its own secrets, Holmes barely spoke during the journey north. He sat still, his fingers steepled beneath his chin, eyes half closed, not sleeping, but listening, it seemed, to the echo of clues gathering in his mind like drops into a cistern. I knew better than to interrupt. He was threading together disparate strands, the ledger from Rutledge Hall, the cryptic invitations from Duval, the vanished members of the circle, and now the final suggestion that the past was not merely returning, but being orchestrated. It was nearly dusk when we arrived back at the Balmoral. Holmes requested tea, declined supper, and spent 2 full hours at the writing desk, scribbling out a sequence of letters and dispatching them via boy to various corners of the city. I watched with growing curiosity. Who are you writing to? I asked finally. Holmes looked up, his gray eyes sharp beneath the lamplight. To those still breathing. The circle? He nodded. Carruthers, Blythe, and a third Dr. Julian Fenn's widow, Helena. She now resides in Newtown, and I suspect she knows more than she pretends. You think one of them is in league with the killer? Holmes stood and moved to the fireplace, throwing in another log before replying. I no longer believe this is the work of a single man, at least not in action. Bracknell or Duval may have authored the scheme, but someone else is aiding him, someone with access, insight, and motive. It is a pattern I have seen before. The ghost of the past cannot walk unaided in the present without a living accomplice. And who do you suspect? Carruthers would be the obvious choice. He was conflicted from the start, yet never publicly denounced the Circle. But Blythe has been conspicuously silent since McCrae's death. And then there is Helena Fenn. She has inherited much of her late husband's estate, and according to records, paid handsomely to suppress inquiries into his final whereabouts. But if she's merely protecting his name, then she is guilty of sentimentality, not conspiracy. But I suspect she knows more of his secrets than she lets on. Holmes turned back to me, his voice low. I intend to test each of them, but for that we shall need bait. The next day, Holmes had us call at the residence of Lord Carruthers, a tall Georgian home on Harriet Row, its stone facade immaculate despite the drizzle. Carruthers greeted us himself, looking older than when we had last seen him, the burden of history heavy upon his shoulders. His face was thin, his manner reserved, and his voice laced with the weariness of a man who had long feared the past might catch up. "You've found something," he said once we were seated in his study, the door drawn shut behind us. Holmes met his gaze. We found Rutledge's ledger and the name Graham Duval. Carruthers drew in a breath and closed his eyes for a moment. "Then it's true. I'd hoped, God help me, I'd hoped it was all exaggeration, that Harker's claims were rooted in distortion, not fact." Holmes tilted his head. "Then you recall Bracknell?" "Yes, he was. A firebrand, unyielding, brilliant, yes, but reckless. He believed we had become more interested in preserving the illusion of enlightenment than in actual discovery. When Glenmuir's methods crossed ethical boundaries, Bracknell raised the alarm. Loudly? And you voted to silence him?" Carruthers looked ashamed. "Not in so many words. I abstained, though I might as well have voted aye. One lacked the courage then. It is my greatest regret." Holmes watched him closely. "You received a note recently, I presume unsigned, but unmistakable in tone. An invitation of sorts?" Carruthers started. "Yes, left under my door 2 nights ago. It said, 'Let us finish what we started. The vault no longer protects.'" "You," Holmes nodded. "And did you reply?" "No, I burned it." "Why?" Carruthers hesitated. "Because I feared that even acknowledging it would bring ruin upon what little honor I have left." Holmes said nothing for a long time. Then, almost casually, "Did you know that Dr. Fenn's widow purchased a ticket to York last month?" Carruthers blanked. "No, I was not aware. And that Blythe has withdrawn every penny from his Edinburgh accounts, and is reportedly planning a retreat to Belgium?" "I had no idea," Carruthers murmured, "but I'm not surprised. We have all lived in fear of Bracknell, of exposure, of one another. This circle was once a fellowship. Now it is a ring of ash." Holmes stood. "Thank you, my lord. I have no further questions for now." Our next visit was to the home of Professor Theodore Blythe, a once renowned lecturer on human physiology who now resided in a modest suite above a bookstore in Morningside. He answered the door himself, a man of advanced years with a voice like crackling parchment and eyes that darted with nervous energy. "Mr. Holmes, I have nothing to do with any of this," he said before we'd even sat down. "If you're here about the deaths McCrae, Fenn, it's nothing to do with me. You received a letter? Holmes asked bluntly. Yes. Yes, I did. Full of cryptic nonsense. Mentioned the vault, the pact. Said I'd pay for my silence. I burned it. So many flames, Holmes murmured. Blythe leaned forward, hands shaking slightly. I was never in favor of the cover-up. I only agreed for the sake of the school. If Bracknell has returned, I wish him no harm, but I want no part in his crusade. Would you testify, if asked? Holmes said. If the manuscript surfaced? Blythe swallowed hard. No, I'm too old. I've nothing left but my name. Let the past devour itself. That evening, we returned once more to our rooms, where Holmes sat by the window, watching the rain descend upon Princess Street like a veil. 3 men, he said. One remorseful, one terrified, one fleeing, but not one truly innocent. Then, what is your plan? Holmes tapped the edge of the Rutledge ledger. They believe the manuscript to be gone, that it was lost, destroyed. But if I were to hint that a complete copy had been found complete, authenticated and ready for publication, it might force our shadowed conspirator to act, especially if they've killed to keep it buried. You mean to lay a trap? Yes, a public trap, one they cannot ignore. Holmes stood and took up his coat. I shall pay a call on Miss Isabel Kerr at the Reformist. We are going to publish a short announcement in tomorrow's edition. What kind of announcement? One that says the full truth will be revealed. At a public lecture in 2 nights' time at the Edinburgh Medical College. That a recovered manuscript will be presented. That all surviving members of the Circle are invited to attend. I blinked, but there is no full manuscript. No, Holmes said, lips curling faintly. But our unknown adversary does not know that, and the promise of exposure will force their hand. Outside the wind howled again, and somewhere, in the distance, a bell chimed the hour. Holmes turned to me with a strange, quiet certainty. We are no longer chasing shadows, Watson. They are coming for us. Chapter 9. The shadows that stirred the following morning. A hush fell over Edinburgh, as though the very stones of the city were listening. Holmes had risen before dawn, dressed meticulously, and made his way through the winding alleys of the old town with the silent precision of a man accustomed to darkness. I followed, somewhat bleary-eyed, but keenly aware that we were entering the final movement of this grim and complicated orchestration. The day's edition of the Reformist arrived shortly after breakfast. Holmes, standing at the window-sill of our suite at the Balmoral, opened the paper and scanned the headline of the small column we had arranged with Isabel Kerr. Lost Ledger of the Circle, a recovered manuscript and public disclosure aid document, long believed to be buried, has come to light once more. A private lecture will be held tomorrow evening at Edinburgh Medical College, open to scholars and interested parties. In attendance, it is rumored, will be the last surviving members of the Edinburgh Circle. A page of history, long sealed, may be turned. No author was listed. The notice was precise and measured, just cryptic enough to be bait, but tantalizing enough to spark whispers. Holmes gave a small, satisfied nod. The invitation has been extended, he murmured. Now we shall see who feels the noose draw tight. That day was consumed in preparation. Holmes met discreetly with Inspector Lennox of the Edinburgh City Constabulary, who had long worked. In uneasy alliance with him, though not Lestrade, Lennox possessed a weary shrewdness and a grudging respect for Holmes' methods. "Do you suspect violence?" Lennox asked as Holmes laid out the plan in the police office. "I suspect desperation," Holmes replied, "and desperation in the intelligent is far more dangerous than in the simple." "Then we'll post plain-clothes men at all entrances to the medical college," Lennox agreed. "Two inside the lecture hall. Do you want them armed?" Holmes considered discreetly, but the key is to remain invisible. If the perpetrator suspects surveillance, they may not act. Holmes returned to our suite by late afternoon with 2 sheafs of counterfeit pages he had printed at Chamberlain's lithography shop in York. I examined them with a mixture of admiration and unease. They appeared aged, annotated, stamped with Glenmuir's old watermark, and bore Rutledge's clipped hand. "They'll serve as our stand-in manuscript," Holmes said. "Enough to pass inspection from across the room. No one will be allowed to read it, of course. And if someone demands to see more, they won't, because they will not care what's written. Only that it exists." That evening a slow tension unfurled over the city. The wind shifted eastward, and a shivering fog began to creep down the alleyways, swallowing lamps in its path. The atmosphere seemed to echo the nature of the case, its self-obscured truths drifting beneath surfaces, waiting for the unwary to stumble in. Holmes paced with feline energy, checking and rechecking the prepared materials for the lecture. I could see that he was restless not with fear, but anticipation, the kind of stillness a hunter wears before a snare is sprung. "Watson," he said, halting his stride, "you are to accompany me to the dais, but remain silent throughout. Watch the audience. Watch their reactions not only to the manuscript, but to one another. If we are correct, our accomplice or our killer will reveal themselves not with words, but with instinct. And if they try to escape, they won't make it far," he replied grimly. "The exits will be covered." The lecture hall at Edinburgh Medical College was an austere chamber of oak benches, vaulted arches, and walls lined with anatomical charts and busts of revered physicians. That evening it was filled with murmuring figures, seated in tight clusters, coats steaming faintly from the damp night. I recognized some of them: journalists, skeptical academics, a handful of curious students. But more importantly, I saw them the remnants of the circle. Lord Carruthers, seated in a corner, stiff and pale. Professor Blythe, hunched low in his chair, his eyes flicking nervously across the rows. And, to my quiet surprise, Helena Fenn, veiled in black, seated with her hands folded in her lap like a mourner at a funeral. Holmes entered quietly, carrying the black folio that contained the imitation manuscript. He placed it on the lectern, eyes scanning the room. For the briefest of moments, his gaze met mine, and I saw the certainty there. Then he began to speak. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, "you have gathered here not merely to witness a revelation, but to reckon with an old truth. What you see before you is a facsimile of the manuscript long believed buried beneath the clock tower of Craigleith Hospital, a record of the Edinburgh Circle's most secret deliberations." A murmur stirred among the rows. The manuscript, if authenticated, implicates several key figures in a conspiracy to falsify scientific trials, suppress dissenting voices, and silence one man who dared challenge their consensus. One Dr. Percival. Bracknell. Gasps rippled through the room. Holmes turned a page slowly. "This document does not merely accuse. It records decisions, votes, motives. It is, in every sense, a confession. I watched the crowd carefully. Blythe stared downward, lips moving silently. Carruthers looked faint, his hand gripping the bench. But it was Helena Fenn whose fingers had curled tightly around her satchel, eyes fixed not on the lectern, but on the door behind us. Holmes, too, must have seen it. I must add, he said, raising his voice slightly, that those who buried the truth did not do so alone. One among them aided its unearthing, if only to ensure it could be destroyed again. The tension was electric. Tonight I invite them to step forward, to explain their role. Before another voice is silenced, the room held its breath. Then crack. A sound echoed like the snap of a gunshot. The crowd lurched. Some rose, others ducked. But there was no smoke, no scream. Only the unmistakable shattering of glass. Holmes moved like lightning to the window. I followed and saw what had caused the uproar. A stone, hurled from the dark street, had shattered the window behind the dais. It had struck the back wall. Denting the plastered dot at its feet lay a single sheet of folded parchment, weighted with lead. Holmes scooped it up without hesitation, unfolded it. Read. His expression shifted once, subtly, then hardened. "What does it say?" I asked. He did not speak immediately. Instead, he turned back to the crowd, raising the parchment high. "There will be no further witnesses," he said coldly. "Not tonight." He gestured to Lennox, who had risen in the back row. "Clear the hall, carefully." "But what happened?" I asked under my breath. "What was written?" Holmes handed me the sheet. The message was in a careful, looping hand. It read, "You are too late. The ledger you read was not the first. One more remains, the final record. I will not let them speak. I will finish what they started." G.D. Chapter 10. A voice before the silence. Lecture hall emptied in a hush of confusion and muttered theories. Lennox's officers moved quickly and quietly, escorting the attendees without incident. Only Lord Carruthers, Blythe, and Helena Fenn remained at Holmes' insistence. The three sat apart, each alone on a different bench, as though the decades of shared history had become poisoned. Holmes stood before the broken window, the message still in his hand. His expression was as unreadable as stone. When the last guest had gone and the doors were locked behind us, he finally turned to face the room. "The author of this note, presumed to be G.D., has confirmed what we feared. There's another ledger, the original, the one we've yet to find. The one Bracknell wrote before Rutledge chose silence." "And you believe it still exists?" asked Inspector Lennox, approaching the dais. "I am now certain of it," Holmes said. "And if it falls into the wrong hands or remains in the right ones too long, another death will follow." He turned to Carruthers. "Where did Bracknell reside before his exile?" Carruthers looked startled. "He kept rooms on George Square above the chemist's, but they were cleared out long ago after the scandal." "Any family?" Holmes pressed. "No. He was unmarried, a recluse by nature." Holmes nodded and turned toward Helena Fenn. "And you, madam, do you still claim ignorance of your late husband's correspondence with Graham Duval?" Helena stiffened. "I've told you what I know. My husband was anxious in his final weeks. He burned letters, removed books from his shelves. I found pages torn from his journal, but he never spoke Duval's name aloud to me." Holmes's voice sharpened. "You purchased a rail ticket to York, Did you not, 3 weeks before his death?" She paused only a moment, then lifted her chin. I went for answers. Julian had become a stranger. He muttered in his sleep names, places. One night he said Craigleith and Bracknell in the same breath. I had never heard either name before, but I suspected it had something to do with the Circle, so I followed a trail from his records, and it led me to the name Graham. "Duval. You met him?" "No," she said, eyes dark, "but I saw someone watching the house on King Street. I waited outside. The curtains never moved, but that night someone followed me back to the station. I returned to Edinburgh and told no one." Holmes exchanged a glance with Lennox. "I believe our killer has grown reckless. They are no longer content with shadows. The warning thrown tonight was a message to the last survivors of the Circle. They will act again, soon." That night, Holmes refused rest. He sat before the hearth, the embers casting long shadows across his face. The message from G.D. opened before him on the side table. I knew better than to interrupt him, though the silence was thick with tension. After an hour he suddenly rose and paced the room. "Watson," he said, "what if Duval is not a name at all?" I blinked. "What do you mean?" "Think like Rutledge. Think like a man who believed language itself could shield secrets. G.D. we assumed it to be Graham Duval, Bracknell's alias. But what if that was deliberate misdirection? Suppose G.D. is not a name but initials with a different origin? Then what do they stand for?" Holmes moved to the shelf where he had placed Rutledge's ledger. He opened it and began flipping through the final pages. "There," he said, pointing to a line. "Entry, October 14th, 1868. Glenmere warns against further pursuit. The garden door must remain shut." "The garden door," I read aloud. "A metaphor or a location?" Holmes replied. "Think back to the message thrown tonight. It referenced the final record and warned I will finish what they started. If Glenmere used the phrase to refer to a hidden place, then it may be literal. A hiding spot. A garden. But the door? Exactly? And if I'm correct, it lies within Craigleith itself, or rather beneath it." By dawn we were already making our way to the crumbling remnants of Craigleith Hospital, now decommissioned and silent behind rusted gates and overgrown hedgerows. Lennox met us at the edge of the grounds with 2 constables in tow. A groundskeeper had unlocked the service gate, and we passed beneath the decaying archway into the courtyard. Craigleith was more ruin than structure now. Windows shattered, ivy cracking through brickwork, corridors echoing with damp and rot. Yet Holmes moved with purpose, tracing steps as though walking through memory. "This way," he said, turning down a corridor with broken lanterns hanging from iron hooks. To the west garden, beneath the chapel. We descended a narrow flight of stairs that curved behind the old chapel. The walls were slick with moss, the air thick with mildew and the weight of disuse. At the bottom stood a small iron door, half buried by vines and soil. "The garden door," Holmes murmured. He knelt, brushing aside detritus and rust. The lock was old, but not irreparably corroded. One of Lennox's men produced a skeleton key, and after a moment's effort, the door creaked open. Inside was a small chamber once, a gardener's storehouse perhaps. Dust hung in the air, disturbed by our entry. Crates lined the walls. But in the center, on a raised stone shelf, rested a flat box of lacquered wood. Holmes approached it without hesitation. He lifted the lid. Inside lay the original manuscript. The pages were bound in twine, yellowed with age and dense with writing. A title page read, Testament of Percival Bracknell, 1863. To be read only when the last light fails. Holmes stared at it for a long moment, then turned to Lennox. We have it, but so does the killer. He must have known of this place. The thrown message was not a warning, it was a provocation. He means to retrieve this before we do. Suddenly footsteps, heavy, rushing, then a scream. Lennox drew his revolver. We ran back up the stairs toward the corridor above. There, at the end of the hall, one of the constables lay motionless. Blood smeared the floorboards, and beyond him, the figure of a man fled into the fog. Stop! Lennox roared and gave chase. Holmes didn't follow. He knelt beside the fallen constable and checked for breath. Alive, he said. A blow to the head, meant to silence, not kill. I looked at him in alarm. The killer was here, Holmes. He stood slowly. No, Watson. The killer is still here. Chapter 11. The Runes of the Forgotten. The fog thickened around Craigleith as we stood in the ruined corridor, the battered constable lying insensate beside us. Lennox had given pursuit to the fleeing figure boots pounding through wet gravel, but the mist swallowed him within seconds. The killer had vanished into the folds of Edinburgh once again. Holmes remained motionless for a long moment, staring into the vacant corridor as if reading something I could not see. He was paler than usual, though his voice remained steady when he finally spoke. That was not the killer, he said flatly. That was a distraction, a very deliberate one. I stared at him. You think he sent someone to mislead us? Not sent, used. Perhaps someone who had knowledge of the location, someone desperate or easily manipulated. The real mind behind this remains elsewhere, and he knows we found the manuscript. He turned to the unconscious constable, then crouched beside him. Gently, Holmes extracted something from the man's coat, a folded slip of paper. He opened it, and his eyes narrowed. Watson, he said, handing it to me. Read. I unfolded the scrap, written in the same looping hand as the window note. This changes nothing. Your trap is meaningless. The light you found cannot burn away what was sealed in the dark. G.D. Holmes stood swiftly. He's taunting us again. But taunts are confessions. In disguise. Then what now? I asked. We push forward. He expects us to waver. But tonight, we step into the very place where the circle ended and where I believe it all began. It was just past 6 o'clock when we arrived at George Square. The building Bracknell had once called home stood near the university, 3 stories of soot-stained stone, its windows curtained, and its door half swallowed by ivy. The chemist's shop beneath was long shuttered, and the upper flats were supposedly abandoned, but Holmes had arranged for the place to be opened. The land registrar, bribed discreetly, had allowed temporary access. The lock gave with a protesting groan, and we ascended the narrow stairwell, our footsteps muffled on the faded runner. Bracknell lived here until the circle expelled him, Holmes said as we reached the third-floor landing. He vanished shortly after, but I suspect he returned more than once, and others have visited since. He turned the final key and pushed open the door. The room was cold, stale with disuse. and filled with the strange silence of places forgotten. Yet there were signs that someone had disturbed it in recent months. A broken teacup in the hearth, a dustless circle on the desk where something had recently rested, a faded photograph of 5 men members of the circle pinned, crookly, too. The wall with a tarnished nail, Holmes crossed to the desk. A single drawer had been forced open, and then stuck fast again. With a thin blade, he jimmied it free and pulled it wide. Inside was a slim, leather-bound book, not Bracknell's hand, but newer. Holmes turned to the first page and smiled without warmth. "The killer's notebook," he murmured. "Written in code, yes, but this is a personal record. And see here ink stains. Fresh. He was here. Likely is still watching." Holmes turned toward the window and parted the curtain. From this vantage, the entire street could be seen clearly. The Royal College in the distance, the alley, the rooftops. He turned back to me. "We laid the trap here, Watson, tonight." By 9 o'clock, Holmes had written 3 letters. Each was hand-delivered by messenger to the following recipients: Lord Carruthers, Professor Blythe, and Helena Fenn. Each letter was brief and mysterious. "You are invited to an informal reading of the Bracknell manuscript at George Square. Midnight. Attendance is compulsory. Come alone." "You believe they will come?" I asked, watching Holmes seal the final envelope. "They have no choice," he said. "If they fail to appear, it confirms guilt or fear. Either is revealing." He stood by the window as the night deepened. The gas lamps outside flickered in the wind. Somewhere far off, a carriage clattered across cobblestones, then faded. Holmes' voice dropped lower. "Tonight, Watson, we deal not only in evidence, but in pressure, in nerves. I am going to speak lies and truths alike. The guilty will reveal themselves not by words, but by reactions." He turned to the fireplace and added a final log to the grate. "The killer will come, and they will come armed with more than memory." At 11:30, the bell at the door below rang once. We heard slow steps climb the stairs. Then a knock. Holmes opened the door. Lord Carruthers stepped into the room, his cloak damp from fog. He removed his hat and glanced about nervously. "You meant it then? You found the original manuscript?" Holmes gestured to the desk, where the document lay open. "You will have your answers shortly." Another knock. Then another dot within 10 minutes. All 3 had arrived. Professor Blythe clutched a cane and looked ill at ease. Helena Fenn wore morning black, her eyes alert and glassy. They stood apart, barely acknowledging one another. Holmes locked the door. "We are all gathered now," he said, stepping to the center of the room. "You 3 have more in common than most families. You shared secrets, then you shared silence. What you do not share is a future." He paused to let the words settle. "I will read 3 pages from this manuscript, real or false, I shall not say, but they are damning." He opened the folio and read slowly. And when Bracknell objected, they laughed. Rutledge alone cast a dissenting vote. Glenmere offered payment in exchange for silence. The vote carried. Bracknell was expelled, and yet something was taken from him, something that would not remain. Buried. Holmes closed the folder. "Now I ask one question. Which of you returned here, to these rooms, after Bracknell was gone?" Silence. Then Carruthers spoke, voice strained. "I did once. In '67 I hoped to recover notes evidence of what we had done. But there was nothing. The place was already gutted. Helena's eyes narrowed. I came as well after Julian died. I was looking for something. I don't know what, but I never entered. I stood at the door. And you, Professor Blythe? Holmes asked softly. Blythe's hands trembled. I never returned here. I refused to come. I was afraid of what I might find. Holmes's eyes were like blades, but someone did come multiple times. Someone left pages, left notes, watched others, hurled stones, followed trains, assaulted men in shadows. Someone who walks among us now, unseen. He moved slowly to the curtain, then threw it wide. Below, in the fog, stood a figure. Watching. Holmes turned without hesitation. Watson, stay with them. Do not let them leave. He unlocked the door and descended the stairs. I remained frozen. The air was taut as wire. Helena Fenn stared at the floor. Carruthers had begun to sweat. Blythe stood rigidly, like a man awaiting execution. Then I heard the click of a weapon, subtle, faint. Helena's hand trembled beneath her cloak. Drop it, I said firmly. She looked up, eyes wild. I had nothing to do with the deaths, she hissed. But I knew it would come to this. Julian warned me before he died. He said one of them would return. I only wanted the ledger destroyed. Holmes will know the truth, I said. No, she whispered. He's walking into a trap. Outside, Holmes had reached the street, but the figure was gone. Only a letter remained, pinned to the lamp post with a surgical knife. Asterisk, you're clever, Mr. Holmes, but not enough. The final voice speaks tomorrow. Then all is silence. Asterisk, Holmes turned and looked up at the window where I stood. His eyes were calm. But in that moment, I knew the final act had begun. Chapter 12. The last voice, the night wind tore through George Square like a whispered warning. As Holmes ascended the stone steps 2 at a time, the blade-pinned note still in his gloved hand. He entered the flat with a quiet precision, locking the door behind him. I met him at the hearth, where Helena Fenn had since lowered her gaze and withdrawn her hand from beneath her cloak. The weapon she had carried, a small derringer now, sat in silence upon the table. Holmes did not speak immediately. He turned the letter over in his fingers, as if it might speak a second time. The final voice speaks tomorrow. He repeated at last in a tone as grave as a tolling bell. He intends one more death, and he has already chosen the victim. Who? I asked. Holmes's eyes flicked from Helena to Carruthers to Blythe and back again. That, Watson, is the last veil yet to be drawn. He crossed to the desk and laid out the 3 anonymous messages we had now received. The stone-hurled warning from the lecture hall, the note left on the fallen constable, and the blade-pinned threat from George Square. He studied them closely, his magnifying lens working in steady rhythm under the flickering gaslight. Same ink, same hand. A fountain pen with a slightly worn nib left biased. There was a distinct pressure swell on the lower curve of each capital. D. He paused, tapping the margin. Our author writes with the left hand, but only recently. An injury? I offered more likely necessity. A right-handed man forced to adapt. It narrows the field. I glanced toward the manuscript. Lying beside the weapons and letters, its aged cover, now almost an afterthought. And the final voice? Holmes lifted his gaze slowly, and when he spoke, His voice carried an edge I recognized from the darkest of our cases, the moments when theory began to crystallize into fearsome certainty. If I am correct, the killer has never intended to silence the circle out of revenge, nor even out of grief. He intends to complete what the circle once began. The vault Glenmere spoke of was not only a place of concealment, but a covenant, and someone who was never allowed inside is now forcing his way in. We escorted our 3 guests from the flat under police guard, each given strict instructions not to stray from their lodgings for the next 24 hours. Lennox agreed to station 2 constables at each of their addresses. Helena Fenn said nothing as she left, her eyes rimmed with something more than fear, something closer to fatalism. Lord Carruthers looked as though he had aged a decade in the span of 2 hours. Blythe offered a final, shaking farewell, his cane tapping the stone as he disappeared into the mist. Holmes and I remained behind Dot at 2 in the morning. We returned to our rooms at the Balmoral, but neither of us slept. The air had turned bitter, and the lamps outside the hotel bent in the wind like silent mourners. Holmes set about a quiet routine. He reread Bracknell's manuscript, paced intermittently, then sat again, comparing the anonymous notes to a few newly recovered correspondences from Julian Fenn's private archive. He had received them by courier from Isabel Kerr that afternoon, a small collection of letters, salvaged from the journalist's failed investigation. One envelope stood out. "Watson," he said, holding the envelope to the light. This was delivered to the reformist 3 days before McCrae was killed. It's unsigned, naturally, and marked as a source document. But look here again, a left-leaning script. And here this flourish in the G. He passed it to me. The contents were brief. The ghosts of Craigleith stir again. The ledger was never the end. Seek the rooms beneath the flame. The one who remains silent is the one who knows all. The rooms beneath the flame. What does that mean? I asked. Dot. Holmes was already rising. I believe it is a reference to the old medical wing beneath the anatomical theater, a vaulted cellar once used for dissection, the flame symbolic of enlightenment, or simply the gas torch above the dais. He turned, coat already in hand. We go now. The anatomical theater at the Edinburgh Medical College was locked at that hour, but Lennox had anticipated Holmes's request. A sleepy but obliging custodian awaited us with a brass ring of keys. The great hall was empty, its bleachers rising. Into the gloom, its central table cast in sickly yellow light. We descended beneath the theater floor through a narrow, dust-choked passage. The air grew colder, thick with the scent of old chemicals, and time dot, we reached the cellar. The stone chamber was filled with crates, old surgical tools, and scattered furnishings. Holmes moved with care, scanning each surface until he found what he was looking for. Door low, iron banded, and locked with a mechanism older than the college itself. He knelt and examined the hinge, recently disturbed. He sighed. Note the scuffing here boot marks, the dust displaced. With practiced speed, he picked the lock, and the door creaked, open with a groan that echoed down the corridor, like the opening of a crypt. We stepped inside. What we found was a study long, abandoned, but unmistakably preserved. A desk stood against the far wall, piles of books, photographs of surgical diagrams, and in the center, lit only by our lantern, a painting. Holmes approached it. "It's Bracknell," he murmured. "An early portrait." The man in the frame was younger, severe of expression, the eyes dark and burning. Beneath the frame, inscribed on a brass plate, P. Bracknell, founder-1859. Holmes turned. This is where the circle began. I was still absorbing the scene when something crunched beneath my foot. I bent. A scrap of paper crumpled, torn from a notebook. Holmes took it and unfolded it, slowly. Another message. He was the last light. Now he is gone. Only I remain. Tomorrow, at the flame. Holmes inhaled slowly. "He plans to strike here," I whispered. "No," Holmes replied, his eyes narrowing. "He plans to strike above." By dawn, we were back in Lennox's office, laying out the details. "I want the lecture theater watched from within and without," Holmes said. "No fewer than 6 men in the audience, plainclothed. 1 stationed behind the stage, and this time armed." "You believe he'll return there?" Lennox asked. "He will," Holmes replied. "He's been circling the theater since this began, sending notes, watching. The final voice will not be his own." "What do you mean?" Holmes's voice was low. "He intends to silence another, a final death, to end the circle entirely." "But who?" Holmes looked away. "The one who has not yet spoken. The one he fears will. The one whose silence condemns him." That evening, we returned once again to George Square. Holmes stood at the window watching the flickering gas lamps. Below, the city moved slowly, coaches and carts, cloaked figures in the mist. "Tomorrow," he said at last, "he will come." "To kill?" I asked. Holmes nodded. "To ensure the past cannot speak. But we shall not let him." "Do you know who it is?" He turned to me slowly, the weight of it finally pressing into his face. "I do now," he said, a pause. "And tomorrow, so shall he." Chapter 13. The circle closes. It was a still, sepulchral morning in Edinburgh, the sort of day where even the fog seemed hesitant, curling low over the cobbles as if reluctant to lift. The streets whispered of rain, but none fell. Holmes stood by the window of our suite at the Balmoral, gazing down at the veiled city. His silhouette against the gray light seemed carved in obsidian, sharp, unmoving. "We are at the edge, Watson," he said softly. "Today the killer will strike, or try to." He turned to face me, and I saw in his expression that curious stillness that often settled on him before the resolution of a case, not the storm before the climax, but its eerie calm. "Do you truly believe he intends to kill again?" I asked. "I believe," Holmes said, "that he must. The entire structure of his plan rests on silence, on removing every voice that could contradict the myth he has built. There is one left, and that voice is scheduled to speak today." The college had announced an afternoon lecture in memoriam of Dr. Percival Bracknell. It was to be held at 3 o'clock in the same theater where the false manuscript had been unveiled. The event, proposed by Isabel Kerr, was to be a public coda to the revived interest in the Edinburgh Circle. Quiet end to the storm. Holmes had said nothing of his suspicions to Kerr. He had, however, ensured that Inspector Lennox and his men would be positioned throughout the theater. I myself was posted behind the curtain, beside Holmes. We watched through a slit in the drapery as the guests filed in. I recognized them all. Lord Carruthers, looking smaller than ever in his heavy coat, his shoulders hunched. Professor Blythe, tapping his cane nervously on the stone. Helena Fenn, gloved, hands folded in her lap, her eyes unreadable. And then, last, striding in with quiet authority, Dr. Simon Glenmere. Glenmere had not appeared at any of the previous gatherings. Rumors of his declining health had been whispered. But now here he was, walking with measured dignity down the central aisle to the front row. Holmes leaned toward me. "It is time." At precisely 3 o'clock, Isabel Kerr stepped to the dais and addressed the audience. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, "we gather not merely to honor a physician unjustly cast into obscurity, but to confront the legacy of a group whose decisions still echo in our institutions. We do not claim to deliver justice today, but perhaps something near to truth." She paused, and now, in a gesture of reconciliation, we are joined by one who was there one of the last to know what truly occurred within the circle, Professor Gerald Blythe. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Blythe stood slowly. His face was pale. He clutched his notes with fingers that trembled ever so slightly. He began, but faltered. "I must apologize. Speaking of these matters even now is not easy." He took a step forward, "but I feel it is my duty." Another step, and then a sharp sound. Metal on metal. The clatter of something dropped, deliberate, precise, a scream. Holmes moved before. I understood what had happened. He leapt from behind the curtain, seized Blythe's shoulder, and wrenched him backward just as the man dropped the folded sheaf of notes from his hand. From Blythe's breast pocket, a thin glint of silver protruded. Syringe. Holmes held it aloft. "Laced with aconitine," he announced. "A paralytic, quick and lethal in small doses, just enough to stop a heart before the audience could comprehend what had occurred." Blythe stared, wide-eyed, trembling. "No," he gasped. I didn't." Holmes turned. "I know," he said calmly, "because you weren't the one who prepared it." He looked out over the stunned audience. "You were the target, Professor." He pointed slowly, steadily to the rear row, the man seated beside the north column. Heads turned. A tall, thin man stood halfway to the exit. A moment of pure stillness. Then he ran. But Lennox's men were ready. 2 plainclothes officers leapt from the side aisle, tackling him before. He reached the door. The figure struggled wildly, but was no match for them. As they pulled him upright, the gaslight caught his face. I gasped aloud. Graham Duval, or rather Dr. Nicholas Wenton. "Impossible," I whispered. "He died in 1869. Holmes stepped forward, eyes glittering. "He did not. The death of Nicholas Wenton was recorded, yes, but the body buried under his name was misidentified. A pauper's corpse supplied for the ruse. Wenton disappeared from medical society just as the circle fractured, but he never left Edinburgh. He changed his name. He became the informant, the whisperer in shadows. He fed clues, misled. The press drove Fenn to madness." Holmes turned to the audience. "He is the architect of every move we have traced, from the disappearance of the real Bracknell manuscript to the murder of Julian Fenn." A stunned silence filled the room. Wenton's face twisted. "You don't understand," he snarled. "They stole everything. They cast me out. I belonged in that circle. Bracknell was a fool. They gave him my seat. He questioned what I proved. He accused us of lies. And so you silenced him, Holmes said. Wenton sneered. No, he fled. I waited. I watched. And when they tried to rewrite history, I reminded them, one by one. I sent the first letter to Kerr. I sent the warning to the Circle. But they didn't listen. Holmes's voice was quiet now. So you murdered Fenn, you planned to poison Blythe, and you would have ended it all with one final death, completing the Circle by erasing its last speaker. Wenton looked away. I didn't fail. You can read your manuscript. You can tell your story, but the Circle is still dead. No one remembers men like us. All that remains are ghosts. Holmes shook his head. Wrong again. What remains is the truth. Wenton was taken away under heavy guard. Lennox's men swept the hall for any other planted devices. None were found. Blythe, shaken but unharmed, retired without finishing his speech. Isabel Kerr stood at the lectern once more, pale but resolute, and announced that Bracknell's manuscript would be turned over to the Royal Archives, to be made public. Outside, the fog had lifted. A fine mist still lingered, but the sun broke faintly through the clouds. Edinburgh seemed to exhale at last. Holmes and I stood together on the college steps, watching the departing crowd. Are you satisfied? I asked him. He was quiet for a long moment. Yes, he said finally. The Circle has closed. Not neatly, not without pain. But it is done. He turned to me, that old glint returning. And now, Watson, I suggest we find some strong tea and a fire not lit in a cellar. I smiled, agreed. We stepped into the street, the past behind us, the fog lifting, and the truth at last revealed. Chapter 14. A study in silence. The wind had shifted by the time we returned to Baker Street, carrying with it the tang of spring. The city had begun to rouse from its winter gloom, and yet there lingered in my mind the heavy fogs of Edinburgh, its cryptic shadows, the broken ghosts of the Circle, the final face of Nicholas Wenton contorted in bitterness. I found Holmes at the window again. As I had so many times before, his fingers steepled, the tips brushing his lips. The fire crackled behind him, untouched. His violin lay across the arm of his chair, the bow unmoved since our return. His mind, however, I knew was as restless as ever. I poured myself a brandy and sat across from him, the case still turning in my own thoughts. You never said how you suspected Wenton, I offered. Holmes stirred faintly, then lowered his hands. The Circle was always a closed system, he said. It had to be. Secrecy is fertile ground, Watson, but it also tends to breed obsessive watchers. I noticed that the messages we received were crafted not merely by someone with access to information, but someone emotionally entangled in it. A participant, not a journalist. He rose, moving to the side table where Bracknell's manuscript now rested in a sealed envelope. I had suspected a survivor from the very start, but as we eliminated the more obvious figures, Carruthers, Blythe, Helena, I was left with one. Question: who wasn't named? He tapped the envelope gently. There was a Nicholas Wenton, once mentioned in Kerr's early research briefly, a rising medical theorist. But he disappeared shortly after Bracknell's exile, never to publish. Again, no obituary, no certificate, only silence. But how did he move unseen all these years? He didn't, Holmes said. He wore new names, posed as different men, but he always returned to the places that mattered, the archives, the Lecture Hall, the remains of Craigleith. A killer does not simply strike where he must. He circles, watches, waits. He looked at me. I only confirmed it when I realized the pattern of the notes. Each one was left at a place Wenton had once studied, the dissection theater, the lecture hall, George Square, and the final one at the flame where he had watched the circle ascend without him. I nodded slowly. He planned to end it with Blythe. He wanted closure, Holmes said simply. Twisted, yes, but logical by his measure. Remove all witnesses. Erase the past. Let Bracknell's name remain a whisper, not a record. And yet, I murmured, he failed. Holmes allowed a small smile. He failed because obsession is never truly invisible. Eventually, it speaks too loudly. In the following days, the ripples from the case spread quietly through Edinburgh's academic circles. Dr. Glenmere, whose health had failed sharply after the arrest, passed away before any formal inquiry. Lord Carruthers retired from public life. Helena Fenn, after brief questioning, returned to London, never to be seen again in medical company. As for the manuscript, Isabel Kerr remained true to her word. A carefully edited volume, with annotations and an introductory preface, was accepted by the Royal Medical Society under Bracknell's name. Holmes refused his name be included in any acknowledgment. I am not a surgeon of legacies, he said, merely a cleaner of their wounds. Inspector Lennox wrote us a brief but heartfelt letter, an Edinburgh man not given to sentiment, but who now admitted in quiet lines his gratitude for Holmes' clarity. You saw beyond the fog, Mr. Holmes, he wrote, and you did so without flinching. It was a week later when I returned from the chemist to find Holmes once more at his desk, scribbling at great speed. What now? I asked. Another case? He shook his head. No, Watson. I am composing a letter to a librarian in Prague. There is a theory forming in my mind about a similar circle there, one that never disbanded. I smiled. And so we move on? He paused, then set the pen aside. Always, he said, the mind must not grow still. I studied him, the sharp profile, the glint in his eye, yet something had changed. Not diminished, but perhaps tempered. You've been quieter than usual. Holmes. He considered this, then stood, crossing to the fire. He stared into the embers, hands behind his back. Watson, he said after a pause, there are wounds not of the body, nor of the mind, but of principle. When men pursue knowledge at the expense of conscience, they build cathedrals of glass, brilliant, intricate, but so very easy to shatter. He turned then, and for a moment his voice held a rare softness. I do not grieve for Wenton, but I mourn what he might have become had pride not been his foundation. A long silence followed. Then, with a sudden lift of his chin, he reached for the violin. Enough reflection. The world moves, and we must match its pace. He drew the bow across the strings. A low, haunting note filled the air. Then another. The melody rose neither sorrowful nor triumphant, but something between, like the fog of Edinburgh, lifting at last to reveal not clarity, but the shape of the truth behind it. As I watched him play, I closed my notebook for the final time on that case. The circle was closed, but Holmes, as ever, remained open to the mysteries ahead.